history judge the Prime Ministership of Christopher Luxon. He's only a year in.
I'd just say to you, I think this has been a pretty coherent coalition government. And I'd just say to you, a year down the road, we're in good shape.
It's too soon to tell. The other 23 people who've called themselves the New Zealand Prime Minister, though, the ones whose tenure was long enough to judge, they're fair game. So the listener assembled 3 historians and asked them to rank them. Ranking stuff. It's everyone's favourite game, so we've joined in. I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail I'm talking to 2 of those 3 experts about what was behind their choices and why there was a unanimous and clear number 1.
Everywhere Mr. Fraser had to answer questions about New Zealand, what we are doing, what we plan to do, how things are back home. These boys in Italy are eager for all the news of what's happening down under.
Peter Fraser, outstandingly able, self-taught, great mind, very firm leadership, principal architect of the social and economic policy settlement that lasted for 30 or 40 years from the late 30s, leader through World War II and into Reconstruction. Not only did he have a vision for New Zealand, he also had a vision for international affairs. He did his very best at the United Nations to make it a forum of equals. I think every Prime Minister since him has bemoaned the great power veto that he was unable to prevent. But outstanding at home and abroad.
This is History Professor Jim McAloon from Victoria University.
As I put him down as my number 1, I wondered to what extent he benefited from the acolytes he brought in around himself. I'm not sure, but he has people like, eminent scholars like J.C. Beaglehole and Fred Wood recruited into not quite the cabinet, but they certainly meet with the Prime Minister, who forms his own judgment about them. So that's quite unusual, I think. And it's meant that Fraser's probably been praised by contemporaries who still command respect.
So Fraser had the confidence and the magnanimity to surround himself with people who were experts and to whose advice he would listen to.
Yes, I think that's broadly true.
And this is Emeritus Professor of History at Otago University, Eric Olsen, who's currently writing a history of New Zealand.
New Zealanders, Maori and European alike, have faced tremendous odds with great courage. They were almost entirely without air support, yet they met and held an air attack of unprecedented extent and violence until they were literally blasted out of their positions.
Peter Fraser was Michael Joseph Savage's deputy and then PM from 1940 to 49, so during World War II, respected and trusted by Winston Churchill. He was instrumental in establishing the United Nations, then oversaw post-war reconstruction and was possibly, in the words of the third historian, Dr. Michael Bassett, who's written a biography of him, the biggest single figure in the creation of New Zealand's welfare state.
Anyway, and he does command the respect of the other leaders. So he's undoubtedly a very able man.
Did he do that off the back of New Zealand's contribution to World War II?
Well, to some extent, I'm sure, yes. It was in 1945-7, it was essentially victorious nations.
But so was this one of the first times that actually other world leaders took notice of what New Zealand was saying?
Yeah, probably, yes. I think that would certainly be the case.
But being thrust into an emergency situation and handling it well doesn't necessarily mean you'll feature highly on this list.
A landslide for New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, winning more than 49% of the vote, the biggest victory for her Labour Party in more than 50 years.
This has not been an ordinary election, and it's not an ordinary time.
Thank you so much for being here.
A distinctly modern approach to leadership has put New Zealand in the spotlight, with recent reporting calling her the most effective leader in the world.
Jacinda Ardern may be the darling of the rest of the world, but she's near the bottom of the heap in this exercise. Bassett and Olsen both put her at 21 out of 23.
She undoubtedly had charisma, and winning the 2020 election outright is probably an achievement we're not going to see again for a very long time. I think the handling of the 2 great crises, the terrible events in Christchurch and then COVID pre-vaccine was utterly outstanding. And my reservations begin really post-vaccine, where I think they kept sort of making mistakes, being blind, that terrible system of getting into the country by lottery, only to be short-circuited by people who were able to sort of get themselves onto TV headlines, was, I think, is sort of the beginning of the end.
She's been in charge of a government that's been very bad for our industry, agriculture. She's led probably the worst government, in my opinion, we've seen for 40 years. Certainly the most polarising I've ever seen. There's quite a lot of anger out there.
And I think we're living with consequences we could not have foreseen at the time, and nor could she. However, I think my sense, and it may be jaundiced, I mean, she took children's poverty, and I remember thinking at some point, you know, when she'd be challenged that no progress had been made, and she'd say, I've got a list with 10 things on it, and we've half ticked off one of them, which means 3,200 less kids are in poverty. And I remember thinking, this is a terribly sort of inhumane way of reciting her achievements. The other one, though, which is more telling, you know, the government, she apologised to the Samoan community for the dawn raids.
Yes.
And then we learn, and I remember watching the ceremony. I mean, it's performed like, you know, a scene out of one of the world's greatest ballets. And then 3 years later, we realise immigration is still conducting dawn raids. And it just remains with me. Somebody wrote that, you know, that Labour government was introducing a sort of politics of performance.
Macaloon was more forgiving and placed her at 8.
Jacinda Ardern, one of the maxims that runs through this exercise is that some Prime Ministers are lucky and some are unlucky. I guess before COVID you would have said that Jacinda Ardern on balance was lucky. But then COVID was one crisis too many, and the ongoing nature of the pandemic and the resentment that built up in some quarters at the measures taken to deal with that, as well as a great deal of old-fashioned sexist vituperation, I have to say, in the end, I think, pushed her into the unlucky category. Maybe I'm not wanting to exaggerate her virtues or pretend that she didn't have flaws as a politician. Every Prime Minister does. But maybe there's a bit of an example there of a prophet not being honoured in their own country, as the old line has it. I do give Ardern credit for trying to change the language of politics, and I think some people, I don't mean Michael or Eric, but some people are cynical about that. I think it's necessary. I think she tried to shift the paradigm. In the end, major crises came to dominate. But yeah, I still think that in terms of showing a possibility of a different way of leadership, she stands quite high in my view.
Okay. The list stops at Chris Hipkins.
Yep.
Nobody was impressed with Chris Hipkins. Is that recent bias?
It might be. It might be. It might also reflect my views of the campaign, of his what I and others thought was perhaps an unfortunate attempt to shift to the centre, which didn't in the end pay off. Any Prime Minister who takes over in an election year has a very difficult job. I think I said that the last Prime Minister who did that and went on to win the next election was Gordon Coates, and that was 99 years ago. So yeah, all of them who had that situation, Keith Holyoake first time around, Bill Rowling, Jeff Palmer, Bill English, they all lacked the time to make a real impact. And indeed, too, as far as Chris Hipkins is concerned, whatever one might think about his politics and the way he organised things, it was observed that 2023 felt like the end of a 3-term government, not a 2-term government. And again, that's the only one of all this crew since 1925 who have gone 4 terms was Keith Holyoake. We have this tendency to do 3 terms and that's it. So I think Hipkins was swimming against the tide. And Also, it's very difficult to give a very high rating to short-term prime ministers. Geoffrey Palmer, for instance, is a figure of enormous ability, and his achievements in policy were remarkable. But he was not prime minister for very long, and that brevity of tenure is part of the reason why he doesn't rank very high.
Interesting. I mean, I always thought Geoffrey Palmer looked prime ministerial. I remember I was working at the Herald when he was prime minister, and he would stride through the editorial office with the editor of the Herald, and they looked like they were in charge of the country. Chris Hipkins, he got more points, hanging around at the local chippy than actually appearing in his suit and doing his prime ministerial things. I mean, is there a kind of invisible mantle that voters have a reaction to?
There is a conventional wisdom, and there's something to it, that a prime minister is supposed to be, the old phrase was a man of the people. I think there's still something in that. I think there is still a certain masculine dimension of power. Cultivating that air of approachability, easygoingness, ordinary person. John Key was remarkably talented at that, I have to say. I think Hipkins tried to portray that. Whether he was quite able to pull it off, I'm not sure. But Geoffrey Palmer, I did say to someone after I'd done this that in a different set of circumstances, perhaps a different political culture, perhaps just a different time, he might have had an extraordinarily good run as Prime Minister. Deep thought, very learned, but also I think a very good communicator. Like Helen Clark, speaks in complete sentences, relative absence of cliche, of jargon, the ability to grasp the issues, I think is notable in both of them.
The first man to call himself Prime Minister rather than Premier was King Dick Seddon. He was ranked at 2 by Bassett, 9 by McAloon, and Olsen gave him a 3. Seddon was in charge when women first got the vote in 1893, but he wasn't the leader who got it on the ballot.
Balance died in April of 1893, having pushed the legislation as far as he could. Seddon took it over, and it was passed in September. And there's various stories about how much Seddon welcomed it or supported it. He's said to have tried to engage in various dirty tricks to get it defeated in what was then the upper house of the Parliament. His recent biographer, Tom Brooking, doesn't really buy that because the evidence for the claim isn't that strong. Be that as it may, Seddon did oversee its passage into law and, understandably, once everybody thought it was a great idea, took the credit for it.
Well, Seddon was unusual. He was so politically dominant, the opposition in the end sort of disbanded itself in the hope they could ambush him when he wasn't watching. That failed too. So he bestrides the political scene like a colossus. I think he wins 5 elections on the trot, all but the last, very decisive, and the last he still wins. And then, of course, dies, and Ward doesn't last very long. Seddon's also, I think, quite rightly associated with what's considered the first substantial step towards creating a welfare state, with the Old Age Pensions Act of 1898. But he's also, I think Keith Sinclair described him in this way, he also provides a sort of political shelter belt for a number of other quite major reforms, such as the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act, which in a sense shaped our labour relations through until its abolition in 1991, though it had been falling to bits for 20 years before then. So that's his significance. A master politician with sort of broad humane sympathies and remarkable political skills.
In the 1930s, photographs of Michael Joseph Savage were propped up on the mantelpieces of thousands of New Zealand homes. Free healthcare, raised pensions and state houses.
Everybody is happy. The Prime Minister, Mr Nash, Mr Semple and Mr Lee take their coats off and help to carry in the furniture. Truly a red letter day for home seekers.
He, I think, like Seddon, had this sort of broad humanitarianism, a sense of what was fair wasn't shaped particularly by any ideology, although he'd been a socialist in his youth. And I think that's what began to capture the imagination of the electorate, and not only those who voted for him. I remember I had a colleague who remembered his father, who was a farmer somewhere in the Manawatu, and hated Labour. But when Savage died, sort of joined the throngs of mourners.
He was a very good communicator. And that was his great strength. I think he did have a clear idea of where he wanted to go. He didn't have quite the mind of Peter Fraser, or indeed of Walter Nash. And I think, without dismissing Savage's vision and ability to articulate it, I think Fraser and Nash in particular were the two who made it happen. The other reason where Savage perhaps takes a bit of a drop in the ranking, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that he didn't manage some colleagues well, particularly John A. Lee. Now, Lee turned out to be quite impossible, but I think Savage let personal animosity get the better of him, and Lee returned that with interest. The feud did the government no good, it did the party no good, and it reflected very badly on both of them. And so I think that there's an issue of caucus management that Savage falls down on a wee bit.
Speaking of tricky personalities,
Prime Minister, I will not have some smart aleck interviewer changing the rules of the game halfway through, Mr. Walker.
Now Rob Muldoon and Rolling, they haven't made a hit. They're ruining the country more than just a bit.
I would like to ask you about New Zealand sporting contacts.
Yes, and I would like to talk to you about New Zealand cheese.
Prime Minister, hasn't there in fact been a complete about-face of government policy?
No, we've always defended our right to sell cheese anywhere in the world.
Mr. Muldoon, the Gleneagles Doctrine specifically states...
Look, the Gleneagles document says absolutely nothing about cheese, smarty pants.
Another thing I was going to ask you about is the era of satire. I mean, we used to say, McFarlane Gadsby and a week of it thrived when Muldoon was the leader. Now, is that because he was ripe for satire, or were McFarlane Gadsby at their peak and he just happened to be the leader?
Both, actually, and you can't mention McPhail Gadsby without mentioning A.K. Grant as well, who was, I think, the writer for a week of it, and Chris McVeigh was the third of the three presenters on a week of it.
And then Tom Scott was the listener doing wonderful things as well.
That's right, yeah. I think it was the golden age of political commentary, often satirical, but not always. I mean, Scott was also a serious commentator. It was the golden age. There was a feeling of the loosening of boundaries culturally.
What, that you could have a pot shot at those in charge?
Exactly. I mean, lagging a bit behind, say, the private eye. That was the week that was generation in Britain. But by the early 70s, this is coming on. You're getting less buttoned down, younger generation of writers and commentators. But Muldoon was a gift to satirists and cartoonists. So was Longy.
Your prospective Labour Party voters having trouble understanding your leader.
But there will be we will be having the most exhaustive consultations with our colleagues in caucus, and thereafter taking a recommendation to caucus.
Translation, I will decide.
I mean, they were both larger-than-life personalities.
Yeah.
They both gave... I think there was a Scott cartoon. It was either when Longy reduced his size or when he resigned that every cartoonist in the country felt bereft because that gift had gone.
Both Tom Scott and Fred Dagg, a.k.a. John Clark, came out of Massey University in the early 1970s, a university named after the Prime Minister who Macaloon ranked at 10, but who Olsen ranked second. Like Fraser, Massey was a war leader.
I mean, in the First World War, it's very different, of course, because there was no air travel. So whereas Fraser stays in New Zealand throughout the war and can be consulted, Massey actually gets on a boat and spends almost 3 years in London, where the Prime Minister of England, Lloyd George, sets up a sort of inner cabinet of Prime Ministers, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa. And I went through the minutes of that and decided Massey was vastly more impressive than my old friends, the industrial unionists, had ever believed.
Massey also managed a three-party situation and operated a complicated and contentious caucus. Another PM, ranked at 3 by McAloon, also oversaw a war, but one we tried to keep out of, Vietnam.
I have come to regard Keith Holyoake very highly, and I think he cultivated an image which wasn't quite the reality. He was a very astute, very pragmatic, centrist politician. The lovely story about him and the Vietnam War, although he sent troops and that turned out to be a bad idea, it emerged later that he did the absolute minimum to keep the Americans off our back. And every time some general came from Washington to ask for more troops, he'd make a point of driving them past the protesters and saying, look what I have to put up with. I can't do any more. If I do, I'll be thrown out and who knows what will happen.
All three of the professors ranked Helen Clark, who oversaw the introduction of MMP, in their top 5. McAloon says she had some things in common with Peter Fraser.
The mind, the quality of the mind, longevity in Labour Party terms, and I think also a very clear foreign policy vision as well as a domestic policy vision. And a certain austerity of character too. I mean, everyone says that in private Helen Clark is warm and engaging, but I think she, like Fraser, took public business very seriously and made that clear.
Olsen says over the decades the role of Prime Minister has changed.
It's not quite a pulpit, but it's become more presidential over time, especially with radio and television. And so they have a sort of authority in speaking. But of course, they are the most powerful position in the land.
So rather as people we used to look at as just simply the leader of a party in power, as actual personalities, movers and shakers of people who design change, that kind of thing?
Well, that's right. One would expect them to have some sort of vision for the country and for their party. But you would also expect them to command the respect, if not the loyalty, of their caucus and more particularly their cabinet. So, for instance, one of the things I took into account was whether or not they were willing to appoint people of comparable ability or even greater ability than themselves, or whether they were scaredy cats and only wanted people they could bully.
And with hardly an exception, if any, all these figures were doing their best for New Zealand as they saw it. They might have been disagreed with, but their honesty, I don't think in any case is really to be doubted. I mean, who would do the job? It's very, very tough. It wears most of them out.
So, how will history see Luxon?
Too early to say. No, he's only been in the job a year. There are a lot of issues facing him, a lot of challenges which he has to meet. Perhaps all I will say is that some of our most successful ones, Fraser, Clark, Keith Holyoake, all had very long political apprenticeships, which Christopher Luxon has not had. And I think there's something in that those successful ones knew thoroughly how the system worked. They'd done their apprenticeship. Mr. Luxon may develop into a successful Prime Minister, but 12 months in, it's just too early to say.
That's it for today. If you want to pore over the details of the rankings, grab a copy of The Listener from November the 16th and read Eric Frickberg's cover story. It's also available online, but it is paywalled. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Ben Pearce and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Doctors Eric Olsen and Jim McAloon, and thanks also to The Listener. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.